The exploration phase is just that. It's characterized by a journey into the unknown. It's usually high risk, and inevitably that brings high cost. And because of that, it's usually driven by government agendas. Hence, it's generally funded only exclusively by governments. And this was the case pretty much for the start of the space race and the entry into space. If you look at it from a commercial perspective, the business paradigm is pretty much industry has a role as an equipment or service provider to meet those government agendas. When you go to the next phase, the experimentation phase, not a lot has changed. The experimentation phase builds on the successes and applications that have been identified in the exploration phase. Again, it's usually high cost, but it's a bit lower risk because you do know something about this new environment and how to operate in there. You've been there, you've learned from those experiences. Clearly, this phase is usually focused on the understanding of the new environment and developing a means of operating, more extensive operation in that new medium. Usually, again, it's driven by government agendas. Often these are military, they can be economic, and in some cases, prestige. Again, as a result of that, it is usually funded directly by governments. Again, the industry paradigm is similar to the first exploration phase. Industry is mainly a supplier to the government to meet the government agendas, but it begins to selectively invest or to explore commercial opportunities. The third phase, however, sees a rapid change, almost an inversion of what has happened in the earlier phases. The exploitation phase is characterized by the technology and the science of the new medium being fairly well understood. There is usually a demonstrated value of operating in the new medium, and often unique services are possible. The costs might still be high, but substantial commercial returns become a bit of a reality and can be achieved. And risk can be mitigated in different ways, managed in slightly different ways. Number one, you know the medium a little bit better. But two, in that context, insurance can sometimes become available to insure commercial missions. So in this environment, industry begins to leverage off the government infrastructure or selectively look to build its own where it can return a profit. So the business paradigm here flips dramatically. Industry begins to actively invest in addition to government. So the market forces then begin to drive the environment, and commercial activities start to outpace policy and the legal and the regulatory issues. And our previous panel talked about some of the concerns that might bring, and certainly something that we all need to think about. But for this discussion at the moment, I'm going to focus on what has been happening in space to this date. So let's take a look at what happened to the space environment, the space regime, when space entered the exploitation phase. So if we look at this chart, this tracks global space revenue from 1973 to 2017. So in my view, the end of the exploration phase was pretty much the end of the Apollo missions. That's when, at the time, roughly around 1973, the total size of the space economy was $15 billion at that point. 12 billion of that was the government payment to companies to build stuff for them to go into space. But there was a nascent emerging telecommunications industry that was generating about $3 billion at that point. 1998 marked a real watershed in the space industry because that's the year that the government expenditure on space, what was generated by governments paying companies to build stuff for them, was matched by what was earned by the commercial sector in its own right. So the total pie at that stage was $68.8 billion, split half and half between commercial returns, commercially generated returns from space, and the government programs that were actually buying services from companies in space. Take a look at what has happened since the turn of the 21st century. Since that time, commercial space has skyrocketed, to use a pun. The total pie in 2017 was $383 billion, US dollars. you can look at that and see that even though the government expenditure over that program, over that time frame, has continued to rise, and in fact, government expenditure from that entire period, from 73 to 2017, has a compound annual growth rate of around 3.5 to 3.8%, which is nothing to sneeze about. That's a very, very good compound annual growth rate. The compound annual growth rate for the commercial sector alone since the turn of the century has been 11.6%. Now, an 11.6% return over a sustained period of 20 years is incredibly significant. In that time frame, very few other endeavors have achieved that kind of return. The big one that it's compared with is the Chinese economy, which grew at about 13% compound annual growth rate over that same period. So this is why the venture capitalists, the companies, and countries are saying we need to get into commercial space. There's money to be made there. So again, I've run through some of these numbers already, but you can see that the compound annual growth rate through 1998 of the entire space economy was 6.3%. As I mentioned previously, government expenditure from 73 to 2017 was around 4% compound annual growth rate. But again, that commercial sector, 11.6 since 1998, 2000 in its own right. So commercial activities now comprise 80% of the space economy. The biggest transformation that has generated all of that is the move to the consumer market. And if you look at these charts, so many of the major revenue streams did not really exist 20 years ago. You had satellite direct-to-home television that comprises the largest chunk of the commercial revenue at this stage. That was only just starting to come in place in the late 80s, early 90s. It has skyrocketed since that time. You have the global navigation satellite system, which and services derived from that, which make up the next biggest chunk of that. Nearly 36% of the industry, including the equipment used to receive those. So the Garmin's, your sat nav implements in the cars, the things that you have in your cell phone that are doing the tracking. All of that is part of that GNSS industry and the services derived from that. And you've got the others. Satellite broadband is now increased, and we now have that here in Australia, and satellite radio, which is still largely based in the United States. So when you look at that, that has been what's been taking place in the last 20 years globally. How has Australia compared with that? Well, it turns out that Australia is mirroring what is going on the global stage in space. And many people don't realize that Australia has had an extremely strong heritage in space. However, we haven't been really good at publicizing it. It's usually been people in the know who understand it. And that's one of the things that a lot of us have been doing in the Space Industry Association to try and raise that profile to people like yourselves and others in the community that actually, Australia does have skin in the game, and we do have capabilities, and we can move forward. Some of our reports showed that there are over 600 organizations in Australia that are involved in some way in space activities. The Australian space sector actually generates annual revenues of around $4 billion per annum from both space products and services. The ERG report did a more fine-tuned look at that and came up with $3.94 billion. So we're in that range, and this is what the government intends to grow over the next 10 years up until 2030, to triple that to $12 billion per annum. The Australian space industry has around 10,000 staff that are employed in an activity which at some point requires them to deal with space in some way. Not everybody is full-time in space out of those 10,000, but that's an important part of what they have to do. Those staff are spread across all 6 states and the 2 territories in Australia. And one of the really interesting findings is that we looked at every industry sector that the Australian Bureau of Statistics uses to categorize Australian industry uses space services in some way for just the normal day-to-day running of their businesses. that we expected to find a lot of that. We did not expect to see that every single category included that. If you look at the way that is spread around the industry, we chose to use 9 categories to describe the activities. So it's the satellite systems, it's the things that go into space, the launch system, what takes them there, the ground networks, which sort of control space activities or communicate with space activities, the space-enabled services, which are the downstream products of space. So that's your satellite communication, that's your position, navigation, and timing, that's your Earth observation. Then you've got the support services, which includes legal, regulatory, as well as specific engineering support. You've got space-related R&D, you've got space-related learning, education and learning, you've got the other categories of media, museums, et cetera, public outreach. So you can see that, like the rest of the world, Australia has most of that in the space-enabled services side. We're very strong, though, in ground stations, which I'll talk about in a moment, and very strong in R&D and space education and training. This is just a list, the ABS statistics of where these, the companies, the industry sectors that use space. You can see some of the big ones, federal government, defense, the science community. But look at the 2 on the left there. That's agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and mining. They're big users of space. And again, these are some of the things that we don't quite recognize. Every state and territory has space staff. New South Wales is the engine of space growth in this country. More staff are here, more revenue here, and that's largely due to the satellite telecommunications industry. One of the things is that Australia has a very vibrant innovation and startup scene in space. There are over 50 startup space companies in Australia, and the majority of those are actually in New South Wales. Makes Australia probably the 2nd largest nation or location for space startups around the world outside the United States. Australian venture capital is growing, and it is starting to invest in space. There are Australian space startup companies that are actually drawing venture capital from other places. So Australian companies have secured money from Boeing Ventures, from Singtel, from the European Space Agency. There's a wide range then of, it covers the gamut of new ideas, launch propulsion, launch vehicles, launch services, ground networks, space situational awareness, communication systems, IoT, robotics, Earth observation, small sat manufacture, agriculture information from space. The thing is about new space is that the lower barriers to entry make a wide range of new businesses possible. So Australia has world-class space science. And Susan wants me to stop about this, but this is going to go very quickly. We have strong capabilities, world-renowned in ground stations. We have strong capabilities in scramjet and hypersonic research. We're among the world leaders in satellite communications, including the NBN satellites, and in particular, the way that's integrated into a domestic network. We are a world leader in laser-based orbital space debris tracking, which we'll talk about further in this panel. And we are one of the world leaders in the R&D in position navigation and timing. Australia has significant cells of expertise in that area around the country. So we also are seeing an emerging space ecosystem taking place. You can read that on the slide, but there's a lot of things happening in low Earth orbit. The economy is moving there. We are on the cusp of a near-Earth space economy, and Australian businesses are working into that right now. So it is something that's happening that we do need to be aware of. So I'll close on that slide that, you know, the space industry in Australia globally has been growing significantly over 20 years. This growth is attracting private wealth and venture capital. It is one of the hot areas for people to invest in. Australia has leading capabilities in that area and a thriving startup sector in its own right. And New South Wales is actually leading the nation in a lot of that work. So, thank you.